Okay,
specific.
then let's record. All right.
Wait, okay, yeah, awesome. So, basically what I've yeah, so like okay, I've been kind of taking notes and doing just trying to read some commentary. I haven't been able to find like really great commentary, but just like,
Well,
whatever
what
is
what have you read and why do you think it wasn't great?
um well, the one of them was the Stanford commentary. And that one was good
There
actually
an
because it
article
was
on
pretty
Kant's
helpful.
aesthetics? I don't remember.
Yeah, it's an
It's
entry.
the article is just Kant's aesthetics
Yes, yeah, and teleology.
and teleo. Oh, that's right. Yeah, I think I've read that article before. But yeah, go ahead. You didn't
And
like that?
no, it was pretty good. It's I mean, I certainly need the book. Like I don't think, of course I wouldn't be able to just read that and understand anything.
Read what?
But
I understand it. The
uh
article or the book?
the article.
Wait a second. You wouldn't be able to read the Stanford article and not and understand it.
Yeah.
So okay, so you want commentary on the commentary? That's a typical problem with
Yeah.
content. It's not any easier than the primary literature very often, you know.
Uh, that's kind of what I figured, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's fine.
Um but in particular, I was looking at that notion of purposiveness.
Yeah,
And so I remember you mentioned it's the capacity to fulfill a purpose. And that's kind of like one of the things that I wrote down. But then also one of the things that I found within commentaries that I wrote down is it says an object is purposive if it appears to have such a purpose. In other words, it appears to have been made or designed, but it is part of the experience of beautiful objects. Oh, wait, sorry, that's a new sentence.
what are you
Um,
reading? What's the text you're reading? Or
this is from another, I think this was from, oh gosh, what is that? It's something, it's kind of like, oh, but this one's from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So I don't know if this
Catholic
is that.
Legion, that's a researched and peer reviewed. Maybe it's less prestigious than the Stanford one because it's just the internet and not university. But most of their articles are decent. I don't think you have to be skeptical about. Now, one thing that you might want is, I think the internet, certainly Stanford is good at this. The Internet Encyclopedia, I haven't read it as much, but what I've seen does a good job with this too. Uh, Distinguishing between simple summary and interpretation,
Mm, mm,
right? Because that's where a lot of the confusion can come down between and the more complex the philosophy you get into, the harder it is to distinguish between what is the originary thing that the philosopher is saying and what is interpretation. And with Stanford, very often you get a really clear delineation of different interpretations and who has interpreted it in certain ways and so on. And maybe like what are the basic schools of interpretation on certain certain points. So that's one thing that you'll want to keep in mind, like how much of it is really pretty unequivocal,
mm,
unequivocally what Kant wrote, and how much of it is an expression of a certain school of interpretation. And with Kant, you get a lot of interpretation. So that's another thing. It's like, the more contemporary or the more obscure the philosopher, the less interpretation there is. And, with Kant, you have histories upon histories of interpretation, commentary,
mm.
right? So with the major philosophers, Aristotle's like this too, I mean, there's a whole tradition of different schools of commentary on these people. Um, and so that's the sort of thing where if you're skeptical at all about the Internet Encyclopedia, you should be skeptical about moments where you think they insufficiently distinguish between a summary and an account of different commentaries.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. But
Well,
anyway,
that's kind of yeah.
sorry, that was a big interruption. What were you going to say?
No. I was just well, first I just want to make sure that I have an adequate understanding of a purpose and therefore purposiveness.
Hmm.
This idea that beautiful objects appear to be purposive without purpose.
Hmm.
So in the third moment, the purpose is outlined, but
Yeah.
the way that
Well,
it's written is
yeah,
really
let's go to
difficult
the
to
let's go to
understand.
that. Let me get that part up. Do you remember what section, the number of the section? It's got to be, it's probably just number three, right?
It's moment
No,
three,
it's not three. It's like
section 10.
section 10. Yeah, that's right. Section 10. Okay, and give me the paragraph number and the line number that you're reading.
It's paragraph 220, and it's like the third line, right after the
Those
parentheses.
numbers are the original page numbers. So the paragraphs aren't numbered, but yeah, right where it says 220.
Oh,
It's the
I
first.
see.
Yeah, that's so that people can refer to specific passages between different translations, because the page count of different translations will be different. So that's what
Oh,
those other page numbers are doing. It's just what the original page number was.
got it. Okay, thank you for that. I
Yeah,
see, I
that's
see.
fine. It doesn't really matter that much, but so it's the first paragraph.
Yes. And
Okay.
right after the parentheses, he says, a purpose is the object of a concept insofar as we regard this concept as the object's cause, the real basis of its possibility.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ugh,
Oh,
that's
is
hard.
that a mouthful for you? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I understand concepts
One of the
now.
nice things about that sentence is that even though it is aesthetically unpleasing, it's an aesthetically unpleasing use of language, it's actually a pretty clear definition. So let's just unpack it and see what's going on there. Um, okay, so we really just have like a definition here. Purpose means the object of a concept. Let's start with that. What does it mean to say that you have an object of a concept?
So concepts generalize and they are the form of the universal. So the object is something that has properties that fit into the concept,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. It's basically the referent of the concept.
Hmm, hmm.
Yeah, it's the extension, right? It's like, okay, well, here's my concept. I have an intentional definition, a concept. What does it pick out? It picks out that object. That is, right? So the object of a concept. Um, now what's weird about this is that what we have is an account of what you might call a kind of reverse causality. Um, at least causality here, causality understood in a maybe more broad sense than when you talk about physical causality or what
Hmm.
Aristotle refers to as efficient causality. But what we have here is the concept as the cause of the object. So there are a couple different ways to get at that. Um, it could even technically be part of the efficient cause of the object, right?
Hmm.
In some, maybe not directly, but in some loose sense. Okay, so first of all, let's recap Aristotle's four causes from the Metaphysics. We did talk about this before. It's a pretty important thing to have in your philosophical tool belt. Okay.
Okay.
We'll refer to it all the time. Kant's basically referring to that tradition here.
Could you give me one of them? I always mix this up with the four forms in logic.
Which four forms in logic?
Um, the one where it's like uh all P's
Oh, you're talking
are
about like the square of
Q.
opposition?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so square of opposition is talking about universal particular positive negative or affirmative negative, right?
Oh, yes,
That's what
yes.
you got there. Yeah, so the four causes, that's something different. The Greek word, I will write it out in English translation for or transliteration for you. Atia. That's how it's usually transliterated, I believe. Yeah. Um, Sometimes if you want to if you're ever having a doctor's exam or something, you go to the doctor and you want to sound like you know what you're talking about, although this won't last for very long because they'll probably surpass your knowledge immediately. But if you say, I'm feeling kind of sick and I want to know what the etiology is. I don't know if you ever heard this word before. This is a
No.
um, standard medical term. The etiology just means the cause. Why am I feeling sick? And it's like,
Oh.
oh, your heart has a blockage or whatever, well, that's the etiology. So etia means cause, but it's probably better to translate it as because. Because when you talk about causes in America in 2024, usually when we use the word cause, it means something like the antecedent of an effect,
Hmm.
right? So you've got
Yeah.
cause and you've got an effect. And that's only one type of cause, according to Aristotle. And Aristotle uses the word atia or itia, I don't remember where the accent is, but uses that word in a more capacious sense. And in fact, there are four different meanings to it, according to Aristotle. And those four different meanings correspond ontologically to four different grounds of an object's existence. Okay. So that's a
Mm.
way that Kant might describe it. The grounds of an object's existence are its causes. And
Mm.
one of them is the physical cause, but there are other causes as well. So if I were to ask you, take any object, phone or whatever, and I were to ask you, how did this thing come to be? Because of what is this thing? That's the question Aristotle's asking. Because of what? How? What? Well, baked into the word how is one of the causes. So that's why I ask it in this sort of weird way. Because of what is this thing?
I see. So there is some uh I was about to use the word concept, but I'll refrain so that it wouldn't get too confusing. But there is some sort of
Let me just
intention.
disambiguate one key distinction between Aristotle and Kant,
Mm,
which is that Aristotle thinks that there is an isomorphism between thought and existence.
okay.
In other words, okay, that sounds super technical and stuff, but actually think about it this way. Let's say you're giving a scientific account of water boiling or something.
Mhm.
Does your scientific account actually correspond in a very tight fit to something that would be happening whether or not you knew about it? Does it correspond to something that's actually happening in the world, um, independent of how it seems to you or independent of how you can come to know it? I mean, usually when we think about how we use language to describe what really happened, we're saying that really happened and my language picks it out,
Mhm.
right? That's like the normal way to think about the relationship between language and the world. Most people, when they don't take lots of philosophy classes, think that's the way that when you get something right, that's what happens. Well, that's only possible if language and reality or thought and reality um, are in some sense two sides of the same coin or have this very, that's what the isomorphism is. It's the exact same form. So that the form of the logical forms fit exactly the ontological forms, what really is the case, right? I
Okay.
mean, that's normally the way we think.
Yeah,
It
right.
totally stands to reason that that's a claim that Aristotle would make as a very early philosopher, right? Um, so that's a big distinction from Kant, right? Who says, well, even that word ontology, even that sort of rational image of the way the world must be such that what you say about it is true is limited by the way the world can seem to you. right? So that there
Hmm.
are limitations, and there's a logical structure to those limitations, but it's not really saying what is ontologically the case. It's saying, even to say what is ontologically the case is still on the side of appearance, essentially. It's still on the side of seem. The distinction, though, is when you get to things that are sort of like purely rational, like morality for Kant, there you're really talking about the structure of reality. But there it's not knowledge. It's not objective knowledge in the sense of talking about the sources or the grounds of an object.
So there, when you use the word pure, does that refer to the a priori?
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Pure reason just means a priori reason.
I see. And all
Um,
else is a
so, so,
posteriori.
so you do have knowledge of something when you make a true moral claim, or when you, if possible, say something true about God, which Kant thinks probably isn't possible. But in any case, um, you do have knowledge of a sort. Here's what's different. You don't have you. If I make a claim about morality, or maybe this is easier with God. Let's say I make a claim about God that must necessarily be true, like, for instance, God is a necessary being. Or if I say something like, it is impossible for nothing to exist, and there's an argument for that. Um, but in any case, let's just take on board that that's true. What Kant would say is, okay, you could say that you have some sort of knowledge, but what you have knowledge of is the idea of God, not the object God.
Hmm.
Right? Well,
Yeah.
and you have no idea whether the idea corresponds to an object, right?
Yeah.
So, and you could see the same sort of thing with morality. You have an idea of morality. Now, so first of all, whether or not morality is an empty fantasy is an open question for Kant. And Kant thinks that there are certain postulates that you must assume in order for morality to be real and not just a sort of consistent logical exercise, right? And so what Kant thinks is that there must be a God and there must be an immortal soul. We must have immortal souls, not because that's somehow objectively provable. Certainly, it's not something that we can experience. It's just that those are axioms that you have to take on board in order for morality to not just be a logical exercise. And the only argument that he can give for the existence of God is a moral argument, which is, if you want morality to be real, you better believe in God.
Hmm.
But that doesn't demonstrate the existence of God. It just demonstrates that for morality to, in addition to being consistent, the logical, systematic morality that he develops, in addition to that being consistent, it would be totally consistent and coherent. Well, actually, there are arguments about whether or not it's actually, but let's just grant that it could be totally coherent and consistent without God's existence. It's just, it wouldn't be morality in the sense that we mean of an objective standard for your action in this world,
Hmm.
right? It would just be like a virtual exercise kind of thing. Yeah, in order to actually make it connect to your action here, you have to believe in God. And he gives a reason for that that's complicated. It has to do with the fact that moral people are often unhappy and immoral people are often happy in this world. And there seems to be an incongruity there. And anyway, that's the way that that argument starts. But the point is that maybe you have some knowledge about about morality, about the moral law and whatnot, but you don't have an object that is picked out by that, right? There is no referent in objective knowledge to that. So, whenever he talks about knowledge at all, he's talking about knowledge as it um, applies to objects. And objects are going to be a synthesis of sensation and logic, basically, sensation and understanding, right? But
Hmm.
Without sensation, no knowledge, in that sense of objective knowledge, because objective knowledge means knowledge about objects. And any other sort of purely rational knowledge that you might have is going to be knowledge of an ideal sort. It's not going to be about objects. And so, if you try to derive from a logical proof that God exists, well, you can show what Kant would say is that no, you've demonstrated that given your axioms, this conclusion must follow, but you haven't demonstrated that there's an object that refers to.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then that's kind of in line with that idea that when you give a scientific explanation of something, you've kind of once more demonstrated some conclusion under certain premises, but then whether that correlates to the actual physical events is it
It's
isn't.
a little more complicated just because Kant thinks that sensation is a necessary condition of objective knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And sensation is not purely, that is to say, the experiential part of knowledge is not purely rational. It's not purely ideal, right? Because it's embodied and so on. And so, and this is where you get to the really complicated idea that if you think of Kant as a perspectivist, as someone who thinks that there is mind-independent reality that exists, it's just that it's only accessible through a perspective. If it were just the perspective, you wouldn't have that. Essentially, what Kant argues is that there are certain things that we notice in our experience that aren't consistent with, like a purely ideal construction of the world, right? And so, like, for instance, just the fact that when he's talking about the way that we experience um, the way that we experience change, essentially. So, we have a distinct experience. If I take this book and I do that, or I, kind of turn it around is a complicated situation. But let's say I have this book and I look at it and then I look at it here and then I look at it here. I see that as a succession of impressions. But I distinguish it immediately from if I'm just sitting on a river bank and I see a boat pass by. That's a
Mm.
succession of impressions too, but they're different in kind. Well, that must mean that there's something in the structure of how I synthesize succession that demonstrates a distinction between subjective experience and objective experience, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, or you could do it from the logical perspective, which I tried to describe before. If you take Kant to be a perspectivist, and that's what transcendental idealism means, right? Then the very idea of a perspective is incoherent unless it's a perspective on something. And the perspective on which it is distinct from the perspective, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's not that you totally construct the world in your mind. It's just that the mind is only the world is only accessible through the
The
structures that your
mind.
mind makes available. Or
Yeah.
that's one way to say it positively, maybe more negatively. The world is only available through the limitations of your mind, right? And so
Yeah.
what Kant really wants to do is to distinguish between the type of knowledge we have and the type of knowledge that people like Leibniz and later Hegel want to argue for. Leibniz and Hegel want to argue that, at least in some respects, we are capable of acquiring infinite knowledge. That there's a certain, which means that if you reason about the infinite, God, you're actually reasoning about God, right? Um, which is to say, God as infinite is somehow accessible to us. Because, at least in some respects, our intellect is also infinite.
Mm-hmm.
Kant wants to say our intellect is essentially finite, not infinite. And it's the finitude of our intellect which gives our experience the structure that it has. I could say more about that, but that's the difference. So, Aristotle would probably, if Aristotle were like in the Christian tradition or whatever, would probably also argue that, or at least Plato, certainly. Aristotle is complicated because he was kind of an empiricist too, but Plato would certainly argue that when you think about infinity or the forms or whatever, it's because that part of your intellect, in fact, your intellect itself, as opposed to appearances, is essentially infinite. There is an infinity in you as a rational being that is
Hmm.
just the same as a perfectly infinite rational being. And Kant saying, no, it's essentially different. Human intellection is essentially different because it's limited, it's finite. And from that limitation, he's able to derive the necessary conditions for the type of experience that we have. Right?
Oh, I see. Okay.
Um, but that's the one big difference that I wanted to draw between Aristotle and Kant on the four causes, which is that Aristotle is really talking about what is ontologically the case. And one way that you can talk about the Copernican revolution, which we talked about last time, is it's really just a turn from ontology to epistemology. Is it clear what I'm saying with that? Like it's a turn away from ontology and towards epistemology in Kant. What does that mean?
If I refer to, are you just like meaning the standard definition of epistemology?
Yeah, standard definitions and then kind of flesh out what that means for the way that Kant writes and thinks and so on versus, well, we haven't done anything with Aristotle, but you know enough about Plato to probably say a few things.
Well, I'm taking my Plato class in this upcoming quarter. So,
Okay, well, okay. But anyway,
but yeah.
okay, so let's first define those terms and define them in the simplest words possible.
Okay. So
Ontology.
epistemology would be
Let's start with ontology because
it comes
that
first.
was well, at least historically, was kind of the ultimate science in a way that for Plato, epistemology is a tool to get at ontology.
Oh, okay.
But what is ontology?
It's understanding the nature of things
Yeah,
as
in
they are.
fact, it just means the science of what is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Science of being,
The science of being,
or the
right.
study of being, whatever being is.
And
Which
then
means, as you said, it can mean the, metaphysical essential natures or whatever. Yeah, okay. So like when I say this is a blue cup, you say, yeah, but is it really a blue cup? Since after all, it's mostly particles and void. And it's like, okay, so maybe it's actually the relationship of particles and emptiness or something. Okay, so but we're really talking about what is the nature of this thing's being. And epistemology is what?
it would be the limits to which we understand.
Just translate from the Greek. So theology just means the study of or the science of, and what's
Okay.
episteme?
Knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, so ontology asks questions about what is the nature of this thing's existence. Epistemology asks questions about what can I know about this.
Mhm. Well, that's what I was going to say. I was going to say the limits to which we know things about
Yeah, I
things.
know, but I said say it in the simplest terms possible, because if you don't start with the simplest terms, you'll start introducing complications
Right.
by maybe not really carefully choosing what words you want. So really, ontology is just being science or being knowledge. Well, let's not say knowledge. Being science or being study, or
Mm-mm.
study of being and study of knowledge. And this distinction between being and knowledge is really important, right? So, in what sense is the Copernican turn a turn away from being and towards knowledge?
Mm.
And I'm talking about the Kantian analogy there, right? And I'm not talking about Copernicus.
Okay.
We talked about this last time. It's a pretty
I
standard thing
know.
when
Could
you
you
talk about.
remind me a little bit more? I'm sorry. Too many things for me to remember.
Okay. Um, Essentially, it means something like this. The traditional view is that um, knowledge, or yeah, knowledge or truth comes. Knowledge means when the subject fits the object.
Hmm. Okay.
In other words, when Plato says we have knowledge of, oh, I don't know, the perfect triangle, you see a triangle, you see 1,000 triangles in reality, in physical reality, and you say, yes, those are triangles, but they're not perfect, right? And then how do you know that they're triangles? Oh, and then you might even go as far as claiming, and in fact, the perfect triangle cannot be instantiated physically.
Mm.
So I've never seen it with my eyes anyway. Um, what makes you think you're warranted in that assertion? The fact that you're able to deduce that what really is the case is that there's this sort of definitionally ideal triangle that has attributes that is not shared by the physical triangles, and the physical triangles have attributes that um, make it impossible to be ideal, etc. Right? But what's going on is that you're saying there is a fact in the world, and here the world means everything, including metaphysical world of forms and everything. So there is a fact, an objective fact, that there is such a thing as a perfect triangle. And then when I discover through geometry the rules that help me define a perfect triangle, the subject, me, is fitting the object. There's an objective truth. A perfect triangle has this definition. I see a bunch of triangles and then I start to define them. And then I realize, oh, all these things that I was calling triangles are not perfect. And once I achieve geometrical knowledge, my subjectivity has fit the form of the objective truth of what a triangle is.
Hmm.
So the subject fits the object.
Hmm.
Okay. And the Copernican turn means that the object fits the subject.
Oh, okay. Mm.
Right? And what does that mean? And this is the specifically Kantian move. What does it mean for an object to say something true about an object is no longer my mind fitting the demands of the object. Now, in Kant, I say, well, no, the object fits the demands of the subject. The object fits to say something true about it, to make a knowledge claim, a true knowledge claim about an object, amounts to demonstrating that the object fits the conditions set forth by subjectivity.
Mm.
What does that mean?
It would be, this is very hard. At least for me. Sorry.
Yeah,
It
it's a tricky idea. It's a tricky idea, but the thing that makes it most tricky is it would be not tricky at all if, well, actually, that's not right. It would be tricky in a different way. But it would at least be maybe a little bit easier to like lay down two really distinct camps if Kant were like a radical idealist like George Berkeley or something who thought that the world really just is the mind. But the problem is that
mm,
kind of radical idealism is actually just the same thing as Plato and the traditional view, right? Because what you're saying is it's not that Berkeley um, says that the world is that the world is essentially just the mind, that means that the world is somehow arbitrary, or no, the world is rational in the same way that it's rational for Plato, and that logic is an essential ontological feature of the world, of true reality,
mm,
or whatever, right? And it's discoverable when we think about it. That's really just Plato's position as well.
mm,
The thing that makes Kant kind of tricky is that it's this compromise or this compatibilist position between idealism and maybe a sort of empiricism, or maybe another way to say it is instead of talking about it in terms of rationalism and empiricism, you can talk about it in terms of realism and anti-realism,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Okay, is Plato a realist or an anti-realist?
A realist,
Yes,
right? Mm.
right. What would be an example of anti-realism? Like, what would be a typical anti-realist claim?
Like, would it be a materialist claim?
Well, just state the claim. What, give me the,
Like, what there is only is the given and nothing more.
well, the problem is given. Okay. We want to unpack that word given.
Okay. So,
Because if
um,
given mean, yeah, let's not use the word given.
I'm gonna does what I read that article by Schlick, which
Come on,
is
let's make it easy. Let's make it easy.
okay, okay, okay,
Starting it
okay.
up with,
Would it just be something like that? I don't know, like any sort of metaphysical proposition is kind of like a meaningless proposition just because it
yeah, that would be an anti-realist claim. But
mhm,
what is anti-realist about that? And put
that
it
it
in like
doesn't
the most basic words. Pretend you're talking to a 3-year-old, because you can't really explain this in 3-year-old terms.
okay that there isn't some more grand or some like idea that this appeals to. That's not 3-year-old
I
terms,
would
but
say, even though generally it's not good to define a term by using the same term in the definition, here it might actually kind of work. So realism means when we make a claim about the world, we're really talking about the world.
mhm, mhm.
Anti-realism holds that when we talk about the world, we're doing things with language, but we're not really talking about the world.
Uh-huh. Okay.
That's what it is. That's the difference.
I see.
That's all it is. It's a really simple idea, right? I mean, it's like, okay, so as a scientific explanation, if I give you an explanation, let's say I don't know anything about, special relativity or anything, but let's say I give you a really great explanation for how black holes work or something.
Mm,
Is my explanation, you know, um, does it just have this exact same structure as mind independent reality? Is there this correspondence, this direct correspondence between logical structure and objective structure, or ontological structure, right? So, if I say, like, this cup is on my table, the relationships between those words, prepositions and nouns and all this kind of stuff, and verbs, um, it's linguistic, obviously, but a realist would claim that there's a correspondence between those linguistic relationships and actual physical relationships.
mhm,
There's
mhm,
an isomorphism
mm, mm,
between the relationships in your language and the relationships in the world. Okay, and that's what Aristotle would claim as well. An anti-realist would say, well, how much do we really know about black holes? Do we know anything about black holes, or do we only know things about our theories about black holes? Right? And the anti-realists
yeah.
claim, well, what we know about are our theories, not the black holes, but our theories about black holes.
So then for the anti-realist, is there even a way to know anything at all for certain?
Sure, you know plenty about your theories about black holes.
Hmm.
Another way to get at that distinction, if you've ever encountered they're often what's often described as 4 theories of truth, what truth means. You've got the correspondence theory, which is what I kind of described. Linguistic or logical relationships just correspond to relationships in the world. But then you also have what's called the coherence theory of truth, which holds
Mhm,
that what it means for a proposition to be true is that it's coherent in the largest possible network of true propositions. And you want it to be the largest possible network because you don't want everybody to have their own truth. But it falls short of making the claim that the coherence of truth claims somehow corresponds to the world. It doesn't make that claim. It's just that there's a consistency to logic whereby we're able to evaluate certain propositions as true. But the consistency doesn't tell you anything about whether or not it corresponds to the world, right?
Hmm.
Okay. So, when we're talking about ontology and epistemology, right, there you can see sort of that shift. Like a strong ontologist, somebody who makes the strongest ontological claims possible, would be a realist. Because what you're saying is logic shows me how the world really is.
Hmm.
I suppose certain branches or certain traditions in epistemology would be anti-realist because all you're demonstrating is the structure of knowledge, not the structure of the world.
Hmm.
Kant is in this weird place where he is essentially making a turn towards epistemology, but he wants mind independent reality to be a part of his system.
I see. So he's kind of
And
like
that,
doing a compromise between the two, right?
yeah, right. So that's why I described it as like, yeah, compromise or a compatibilist kind of position.
Compatible.
Um, because, and this is where it gets really radical because, if he were a strong idealist saying that the world is created entirely by the structure of reason, then he's just a Platonist. Then he's a realist, right? And what
Yeah.
he's trying to say is that, okay, mind independent reality has a functional place in knowledge claims. It's not accessible to us subjectively because subjectivity has this essential limited structure that makes certain types of knowledge about mind independent reality available to us. But because uh, because that sort of knowledge, the structure has these enabling limitations, it's not infinite knowledge in the way that a purely rational um, version of knowledge would make it, right? So I I don't know. That didn't come out as clearly as I hoped it would. But essentially, it's like, okay, that's why I just keep coming back to this word perspective. I think it's the easiest way to understand it. It's just, you know, um, what would an infinite perspective be like? What would an infinite perspective be like?
A perspective on everything.
Okay, what would it be like?
Oh, what would it be like as from the subject's view or
Well, if it were infinite, I'm not sure that you could even distinguish between subject and object.
oh, because then it's yeah, right. Okay. Because it's like perspective on everything, including the subject itself and the
Yeah.
object,
It's this
right?
weird sort of thing where actually universal perspective is an oxymoron. It's a self-contradiction, right?
Oh, okay.
Because to have an infinite universal perspective is not to have any perspective.
Yes, yes, right. Yeah,
Right? Um,
that makes sense.
yeah, so it's like purely objective. Well, it's a perspective. I guess it's a perspective, so it's subjective, but it's a purely objective subjectivity, which means that there's no distinction between subject and object, right? But another way to see that is that what Plato or Leibniz or the rationalist Descartes thought was possible is achieving an infinite perspective through reason,
Mm.
right? And once you have a clear and distinct, purely rational mental image, people talk about seeing the perfect triangle not with the eyes but with the mind. And in fact, actually, the word idea, eidos, in Greek, comes from the verb to behold. It actually
Oh.
has this sort of perceptual aspect to it, but it's not physical perception, it's intellectual perception,
Hmm.
right? But the thing is that if you were able to achieve that absolutely perfectly in all respects, universally, through reason, I guess, you sort of wouldn't have a perspective anymore, right? It only would seem like a perspective because you're going from a place of finitude being in this world, not using reason, and you start using reason more and more. And so, you might think of the use of rationality as another sort of perspective, but once you achieve perfect rationality, perfect knowledge, infinite knowledge, the very idea of a perspective becomes self-contradictory, right? And so with Kant, you've got this idea of a kind of basic perspectivism, because what Kant wants to claim as, like a first principle is that human knowledge is finite. It's not infinite. And just because it's finite, it's perspectival.
Oh,
Right?
okay.
Yeah. So like your perspective is only possible because it's limited by your place, your time, your whatever. If you're talking about visual perspective, your eyes, the position you're looking at, it's thoroughly limited. But that's also what gives it its structure. It makes it that perspective, right? Something that Hegel also develops in the science of logic, which I think is kind of interesting, and which you can spin into a sort of, oh, I don't know, coping mechanism for dealing with mortality, um, is this idea that identity requires limitation. So if you weren't limited, you wouldn't have an identity.
In
Right?
the same way that if an object was didn't have like a finite uh dimensions to it, then it wouldn't just be like recognizable in any sense, right?
Well, yeah, yeah, let's
Like
just
it
say a thing, not an object for our purposes here. Yeah, if a thing, whether or not we're looking at it or whatever, we're boundless, and then we're asking, okay, what is it? There isn't any it that you can grasp
identify.
that would be available because there are no limitations. Limitations are a necessary condition of identity,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And so you can think like the way that that might correspond to you know, mortality is like, well, I do kind of like the fact that I'm me. And if I were completely unlimited, I wouldn't be me at all. What would I be? I don't know. I'd be the one or something. But there's a sense in which that is, also a kind of death, right? It's like, um, so even though mortality is a pretty harsh limitation, it's still um, something that makes valuable things possible, right?
And so
Yeah.
doesn't isn't mortality a temporal limitation before it is a physical one?
Um, I suppose, yeah. So couldn't you continue being the same person on indefinitely?
Yeah.
There, I suppose, the prospect of um, going on indefinitely with no hope of ever having a boundary to, unless you're constantly forgetting maybe along the way, but that would be another sort of temporal limitation, right? It's like the forgetting would be required for that sort of I don't know, a sort of malaise not to set in.
Mm.
The idea of just going on indefinitely with no limitation seems kind of I don't know, it seems kind of like hell. even
Yeah.
even if it's in heaven. Yeah.
And I think that's kind of demonstrated by the fact that all of those like Greek mythology stories that of like eternal damnation in one way or another, they all have some eternal aspect to them. So it's like that person who's being damned is like doing this for the rest
Well,
of
yeah,
eternity.
yes, exactly. So, when you're talking about Hesiod and Homer, the pre-Socratic mythological traditions, there isn't really a distinction between heaven and hell.
Mm,
There is the world of the shadows, the world of the shades, and there's the world of, flesh and blood, but there's not the sense that there is a reward in the afterlife.
Hmm.
In fact, there's a point in I think it's, where is it? It's in the Iliad. No, it's in the Iliad. Yeah, it's in the Iliad after Achilles has been slain and his ghost appears, and he talks about how he would prefer to be a slave in the world of the living than a king in the world of the dead. And it's this sense, well, Achilles, the Greeks, the Homeric Greeks had a totally different value system, and different morality as regards what it means to be a great person. Um, but even so, Achilles was a great person. He killed lots of people. He was a pretty violent bastard, but on the Homeric measure, he was good for that reason. He was excellent, we should say, not morally good, but excellent. But in any case, he was punished in death just as much as anybody else.
Hmm.
um, but in any case, we're kind of far away from Kant at this point.
Sorry. Yeah, yeah.
You were asking about purposiveness, and I wanted you to give me what are the four possible becauses of any object. What
And
are the four
so
possible becauses?
it would be you said one of them is the physical one, where it's like the actual physical cause. The
Yeah,
other
that's
one,
called, well, okay. What do you mean
yeah,
by
yeah.
physical? Let's try to, are
What
there,
happens in like
are there, is there more than one way to talk about physical causes, such that you might actually have two different things you mean by physical cause?
oh, uh I'm just thinking of like uh say like basic physical phenomena, like for instance, water boils at 100 degrees and certain
Okay. So
pressure
what are
and
the
temperature.
components of that basic physical phenomenon? Does water
What do you
always
mean?
boil?
No, it's got to
Do
be at
other
under
things
certain
other okay.
conditions.
Does water always boil? No. Do other things other than water boil? Yes. Okay.
Hmm.
So then we've got a distinction here between something making some substance boil and the substance that can accept the cause of boiling.
Hmm.
In other words, you've got, when you say physical, you've got the material. For instance, this book won't boil, or maybe it will. I don't know. I guess there's a way to liquefy this book. Who knows? Point being that there's something about water that um, is disposed, has the disposition to boil under the right conditions.
Hmm.
But there's also something about the conditions that contribute to the boiling. In other words, you've got two different causes there. You've got the material cause, the water, and you've got the efficient cause, which is the heat, the pressure, and so on, that changes the form of the water.
Oh, oh, okay. Oh, I see. Sorry, let me just write that down really quickly.
So you've identified two of the causes, the material cause and the efficient cause. And I should say, after Descartes, those were the only two causes that were treated as actually scientific. So
To
physics,
this day.
no, I mean, we've got a lot of really pretty, the sciences have proliferated and gotten quite sophisticated in the different types of theoretical approaches that they employ. And so now it's actually pretty fashionable to bring in some of the um, earlier discredited causes.
Oh.
But, mechanistic physics, so like 17th century physics that held that what exists are matter and forces, basically only holds that everything that exists can be explained by the material and the forces that act on that material.
Hmm.
Newtonian
Hmm.
physics is like this, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and I'd say that that's still a pretty common idea. Um, it's like really kind of most of your, I don't know, like high school science teachers probably believe that's true.
Hmm.
That's like a nuts and bolts modern period idea.
Yeah.
But it's not sufficient really for describing all of the things that contribute to an object's existence, right?
Okay.
Because, for instance, I take this book and I can describe it in terms of all of the particles that are in play here and the forces that keep those particles moving in the patterns and in the relationships that they're moving in. And I still wouldn't have this book, the Kant Dictionary. What I would have is an object that has all of the physical characteristics of this book, but it wouldn't be the Kant Dictionary. Is it clear what the distinction is there?
No. Well, why is it not the Kant dictionary? Because it's if it's got all the physical characteristics of that.
Let's just say that for all intents and purposes, even though it's not strictly true, for the most part, these two books have identical be explained identically in terms of their particles and the relationships they're in.
Okay.
Basically, that's true. These are not even close to being the same book.
Yeah.
How's that possible? If I can give it just a complete, description or explanation of this thing in terms of its matter and the things that shaped that matter into a certain state, why can't I get to the idea this book versus
So
that?
when you speak of that matter or that composition of it, what are you speaking of? Of like the particles itself? Because if that were the case, isn't it the fact that that difference in particles is what constitutes the difference between the two objects?
Well, no. Okay, I'm gonna try to make a distinction here. You
Okay.
could try to make an analysis of my ability to distinguish between these two books in purely physical terms, that is to say, only talk about particles and forces.
Okay.
And you could claim that you succeed, but there's always going to be some skepticism about how adequate that explanation is. And this is where you get into the mind-body problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because, okay, what would you have to claim in order for these two things to be shown to be different on a purely physical account?
So what I would claim is that they're made up of uh, a different collection of particles and matter. So to make
Okay,
that
well,
like
okay,
a
so you're talking about them being numerically distinct, and that's fine. That's not a problem. What
yeah.
I want to say is you need to show me why they're qualitatively distinct on a purely physical account.
Oh, that I wouldn't be able to do.
Well, you could try. Lots of people
Um,
try this. I mean, it's a fairly well rehearsed research project in philosophy and it's in some sense it's maybe even still the paradigm in a lot of scientific fields. But what would be involved in claiming that um, they are qualitatively distinct from a purely physical point of view? Maybe the way to get at that is I have to go to the bathroom pretty soon too, but
okay, okay.
maybe one way to get at that is for me to ask you, well, how do you know that these two books aren't even remotely similar, even though they share all the most relevant properties?
I would say this one's green and that one's red.
Well, look at the titles. I mean,
Oh yeah, or like
the
the ideas in
content
them,
of the books.
the content. Yeah.
The problem is, I don't know why. Actually, I don't know if you ever heard of G.K. Chesterton. You should look him up. He's like
Okay.
he, I'd say he's like the Christ. So Nietzsche's like the atheist Kierkegaard, and
Uh-huh.
G.K. Chesterton is like the Christian Nietzsche.
Oh, oh.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
can't really think of like conceive of that, but okay.
But let's
I'll
say
look him up.
I've got Thus Spake Zarathustra. I've got a Nietzsche book up in my room. Maybe I should have gotten that. And I hold up G.K. Chesterton, devout Christian, and Nietzsche, you know, devout atheist, if that's a thing. Now these are really different.
Right.
And not because one's green and the other's brown. They're really different because of the content,
Okay.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Now what you have to do is give me a purely physical explanation of how that's possible.
Oh, okay. Is there even a way to do that?
Yeah,
Because,
you could. You'd end up being a physicalist about mental states, about beliefs, about all this kind of stuff.
but then doesn't that always venture on to the realm of quantity? Like you can, it seems to me that you can never really reach quality through pure physicalism, and that's exactly where physicalism falls short.
Well, what you would say is that what we call qualia are simply mental events that correlate or are caused or in some accounts just are physical states. That is to
Yeah,
say,
but
these
that's
neurons
a
firing.
that always, I've heard that explanation much, especially because I have a friend who's a medical doctor and he insists on the fact that all thoughts and all feelings and everything are just like chemicals and all that. But it seems to me that that's a very reductionist view just because it's always it's just very dismissive of the fact. So it like totally dismisses the idea of a thought or a feeling or an attitude or anything and says it's actually not that, it's just a bunch of numbers or
Yeah,
quantities.
sure. Okay, sure. Yes, fine.
So they don't really answer the question, they just kind of erase it.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, we had this conversation last time, and so
Yes,
I want
yes.
to avoid it this time. But
Mhm.
yeah, okay. And then you say, well, no, it's essentially distinct. And then you say, because there is this stuff called mind or this stuff called soul or whatever. And then your physicalist friend will say, okay, give me a scientific account of that. And you'll be like, well, I just know it.
Right.
But anyway, the point that I'm getting at is that it's at least plausible that one way of describing the existence of this as a book about Kant is it can't adequately be approached by simply talking about what is the matter of this book and what forces were applied in order to shape the matter into this state. There's also like information in it.
Hmm.
And the information is what you might describe as one more of Aristotle's forms. And it's called
Oh.
just like you have the word information, it's the formal cause. Okay, so
Oh, okay.
now the formal cause isn't necessarily only information, right? The formal cause will be the shape that the matter takes when the corresponding efficient cause is applied to it. But I think it's most clear in the case of information how why you would need another cause, why you would need another explanation. Because the matter is shaped by the efficient cause in such a way that it takes on this intellectual property, the form. And here, form really means the same thing as what Plato calls forms, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's, even if I were to say this is a book and not a collection of this enumeration of particles and this enumeration of forces, no, it's a book. So you could think of the form as sort of maybe like the intentional definition, but already in the idea of the intentional definition is intelligence. You need intelligence for an intentional definition to even be a coherent idea, right? Because it has to be a logically consistent, uh, you know, enumeration of properties or this kind of thing, right? Anyway, that is the formal cause. And in information theory, that's a science that takes the formal cause on board as actually a significant mode of explanation. So like you look at the matter of this computer program or that computer program, and they're basically the same, right?
Hmm.
What's different is the form that the matter takes when subjected to whatever forces are in play.
Hmm. I
Right?
see.
Okay. And then the fourth cause is called the final cause. and this is maybe the most controversial of Aristotle's four causes, but the final cause you might think of as the purpose of the thing.
Oh, okay.
So, in other words, okay, so if I were going to explain because of what does this book exist, I would say, well, somebody found some trees material, chopped them down and turned them into paper, efficient, and then applied ink, more matter, and efficient causes and so on, such that it took the shape of this book, including the contents, the informational contents of the book. But that wouldn't be a complete explanation. I also have to say, but why did the person write the book in the first place?
Hmm.
Because they wanted to tell people about Kant. And why do they want that? Well, because they think Kant's important, because it makes us better people. Why do they want the world to be a better place with better people in it? Well, because why? Ultimately, we reach some sort of highest good or something, right?
Mm.
That's the final cause.
Got it.
Okay, but it's bound up with this idea of purposes. That if you want to give a complete definition, or not complete definition, a complete explanation of at least certain objects in the world, maybe not even every object, but at least certain objects in the world, you can't give a complete explanation unless you also ask the question why.
And does that apply to every instance of a phenomena?
No, I just said there are probably certain objects where you don't have to ask why. But
Oh,
certainly
okay, okay.
that involves consciousness and reasoning, you kind of do if you want like a full explanation.
Ah,
Okay,
mm,
think about that for a minute. I'm gonna go to the bathroom and then we can jump back into Kant.
sure.
Just a moment.
Yeah.
Okay, back and refreshed. So, all right. Now, what I just said is you got the four causes for this book, including the final cause.
Hmm.
Um, and here the Greek is just the teleology of the thing, the final cause.
Oh, so that's okay. Yeah, 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 yeah. I
Telos,
see.
the telos is the final cause. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, and the final cause, the teleology, the purpose of this book was there was some writer named Lucas Thorpe who probably had all sorts of purposes, including, wanting to be able to pay his mortgage or something. But in addition to that, maybe the highest purpose was that he wanted people to have better understanding of Kant's terminology,
Hmm.
right? Okay, so, and then he thought, you know what? I would like people to have better knowledge of Kant's terminology. So I'll make a book. The book's the object. The thought, I'd like people to have better knowledge of Kant's terminology is the concept. The concept is the cause of the object. That's what Kant says.
I see.
That's all he's saying in that sentence. So let's look at it again. He says, a purpose is the object of a concept insofar as we regard this concept as the object's cause. So
Yeah.
think about this. The concept was, I should write a book about Kant. Well, in that thought refers to this object that doesn't exist yet, right?
Okay.
The
Yeah.
book that I'm going to write. But it's the concept that's the cause of the object. I think I should write a book. I make a book. The book's the object. The concept caused the object. But in the concept, I'm already referring to this object that doesn't exist yet. That's the purpose.
And that's the book, right? That
Yeah,
concept
that's
is
the
the book.
purpose. So the purpose is the object in that thought that doesn't exist yet, that the concept then causes.
So is there some sort of circularity going on there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when you talk about, sometimes people refer to teleology in terms of backwards causality,
Hmm.
right? That there's this sort of sense that usually we think in time, and this is actually part of Kant's definition of material causality anyway, that material causality is essentially necessary time order, or at least something that's entailed in the idea of causality is a necessary time order. In other words, causes in our experience of time always precede effects, right? Um, with teleology, it's a little strange because there's a sense in which the book is the cause of my thought I would like to write a book. But the book doesn't exist yet. The book exists after that thought,
Hmm.
right? And so there's a sense that there's something circular or recursive, self-referential at least, about the very idea of a purpose, which is that the thing that does not exist yet, at least in time, somehow nonetheless is both cause and effect of itself.
Yeah.
And there it's important to understand that, well, maybe it's possible to think about causes in the more extensive Aristotelian sense outside of time, that only
Mm.
material causes are represented by us as being in a necessary time order, but that causes, so purposes as causes seem independent of that restraint or that constraint, right?
Yeah. Because of this very reason that the
Yeah,
concept
that there's
itself has
something
the
self-referential, recursive. Now, this is one of the aspects of purposes that Kant is going to um, make an analogy with moral freedom, where he's going to make an analogy to moral freedom, because moral freedom is also supposed to be cause and effect of itself, right? And so this is one of the things about biology, at least, that is supposed to shed some light on our freedom, right? That there
mm,
seems to be an internal cause in organisms that is kind of self-legislating and self-referential, that's cause and effect of itself. And on an analogy to moral freedom, there seems to be this kind of isomorphism between biology as purposive and morality as purposive.
mm, yeah.
Um, so, that's purposes here. And then you get the added wrinkle that in an aesthetic experience and a judgment of beauty, the actually there are different interpretations of this, that either there is no purpose or the purposiveness is itself the purpose.
Ooh.
Oh, that part's easy. That's just the journey is the destination.
Oh. Yeah. Okay. I remember you mentioned this last time, and with the example that Aristotle gives of taking a walk where
Yeah, yeah,
it.
right, exactly. So
Mm,
the journey is the destination means that, well, the journey is not the destination in the normal definition of those terms.
mm,
The normal definition of those terms means that they must be separate, they must be distinct. I mean, the destination is the goal of the journey, but a certain view of activity as intrinsically valuable would hold that the purpose of the journey is self-legislating, or it's both cause and effect of itself, right? That what's valuable about the journey isn't that it is just this tool that you use to get to the destination and that the destination was valuable. No, it's that there's this intrinsic value in the journey itself.
And so then once more a circularity appears.
There would be a sort of circularity, perhaps. But the idea is that that's one way of reading what he means by um, uh, without purpose, that it's purposive but without purpose, meaning simply that it's purposive but without a distinct object as its purpose. It's just the purposivity itself is its own purpose. Another way that you might read it has to do with what he has to say later on in the teleology section about the possible objects of our knowledge that we can ascribe as the purpose. So, in other
Mm,
words, we see the world as highly ordered, and having all these sort of reciprocal dependencies. So you think about an ecosystem, like a well-functioning, a healthy ecosystem, you can describe in terms of a huge network of interdependent relationships, right? Or even a single organism you can describe that way. So like when you think that, you know, if a tree didn't have its roots, it would die. If it didn't have any leaves or branches, it would die. Probably, maybe not, I don't know. But the point is that the trunk is also dependent on the leaves to continue to exist, and the leaves are dependent on the trunk. And so there's this sort of um, recursive reciprocity between the parts that make the whole possible.
mm, mm.
Right. And there you can again see that kind of circularity. I mean, maybe we shouldn't use the word circularity because that makes it sound like it's a logical error or something. Really, it's
Probably
just
good. Yeah.
reciprocal. It's reciprocal, right?
Mm,
Instead of the logic being one of um, uh, hypothesis, the hypothetical conditional. Okay, so the hypothetical conditional is just the if then in Kant,
yeah.
the hypothetical. Um, that has like an arrow of time, a directionality built into it. But the sort of dependence that is in say a so like a biological explanation or a synthesis of an object as alive or an aesthetic judgment of this kind of thing is supposed to be reciprocal.
Oh, and so
Maybe it's
it's
like a biconditional or something.
biconditional. That's what I was going to
Right.
say. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
he doesn't use that term, the if and only if kind of thing, but, and actually
Yeah.
his understanding of conditionals is different from first order logic. But in any case, um, you know, he does specifically talk about conditionals, if then hypotheticals, as being a relationship of ground and consequent.
Mm,
And in a hypothetical judgment, the ground and the consequent are distinct. They must be distinct. Cause must be distinct from its effect. If it's just the same thing, then you don't have an explanation. But in a purposive um, judgment, there's this reciprocality to it, such that ground is in some sense the consequent of itself, and consequent is somehow the ground of itself.
mm.
Right.
And so can this serve as an explanation for why he claims judgment of beauty isn't a logical judgment?
I don't think so. I think the reason is that for that is that he thinks that it is inseparable from sensation. It's got to
Okay.
be experiential. The trick is that he thinks that experience, um, constitutive experience has logical structure baked into it, right? But it also has sensation baked into it. And so um, when he claims that it's logical, or sorry, not logical, but aesthetic, what he's saying is that if it were purely logical, then it would be completely separable from experience.
Mm,
But what he wants to say is that an aesthetic judgment is a judgment of experience. right? Now, there's going to be some logical structure to it because experience on Kant's system is logical, right? It's
Hmm.
table of categories are all logical forms that are supposed to constitute the experience we can have. But in the case of an aesthetic judgment, it's a judgment that is occasioned through sensation. It's occasioned as an experience. And the occasioning here just means that, maybe I could put it this way. I could talk about it in terms of causes and effects, maybe. This is a little different from your question about logic. But, um, let's say every Wednesday we meet to talk about Kant. Is Wednesday the cause of us talking about Kant?
Hmm. It can be.
I don't think so. I think
No.
it's much more apt to describe it as the occasion on which
Mm.
we talk about Kant, even if we always talk about Kant on Wednesdays. To say that Wednesday is somehow the cause of us talking about Kant doesn't seem right.
It's
That,
just like something that's happening alongside us meeting up to talk about Kant.
well, and it might be that we only meet on Wednesdays. And so necessarily, if it's Wednesday, we will talk about Kant. But from that, it doesn't follow that Wednesday is the cause of us talking about Kant. It's
But
just the occasion of us talking about Kant.
couldn't you make the conditional statement of if it's Wednesday, then we meet to talk about Kant, and so thus there's some
You
causality.
could, but yeah, so the thing is that not all hypothetical judgments are judgments about causality. All judgments of causality are hypothetical judgments, but
Oh,
the converse isn't true.
oh, okay, okay. That's hmm.
So, in an aesthetic judgment, the object is the occasion for the aesthetic judgment, but it's not the cause of the aesthetic judgment,
Hmm.
right? So that's one way of looking at it. Now, that's different, as I said, from the question about why is it not a logical judgment? And the reason is that you still have to have the occasion of the object. If it were a purely logical judgment, it wouldn't be occasioned by the object.
Hmm. Hmm.
I hope that's clear, right? I can see how it can feel like we're really splitting hairs or something, but the idea is that an aesthetic judgment is this hybrid kind of thing, right? It is
Yeah.
somehow, very much on the subject side of things. It's not a claim about the object, it's a claim about something about the structure of subjectivity. But that structure of subjectivity is not purely logical, purely on the side of understanding, because it has this essential experiential part to it as well,
Hmm. I
right?
see.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, no, this is great. Thank you. Because this is actually exactly the stuff that I struggle with.
Well, it's
Um,
not easy, and most people can't really. I mean, I think probably people that talk about this for a living probably pretty clear on it, but it's not easy to figure out what's going on because I'd say though the key is to understand that the structure of transcendental idealism holds that there's not a clear distinction between reason and experience, that there's already
hmm.
a logical structure to experience. Anything that is available to you as experience already has a logical structure baked into it. It also has a sensuous structure baked into it, right? A
And
causal.
what does that mean?
Oh, well, I mean, um, experience is sensation plus logic.
Oh, okay. And by the way, on that, for Kant, sensation is different from sensibility, right?
I don't think so. I think that those are just different ways of translating empfindung in German.
Oh,
Um, I'm pretty sure. I don't think he ever distinguishes between those two things. By the
I
way,
see.
you might want to get there are some that are available online, but you might want to get a Kant dictionary if you have questions like that because they're pretty.
Oh my God, that would be so helpful because I was the Kant lexicon that you sent was it was really helpful, but it
But
wasn't
there's
complete.
not. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
There are a couple more extensive ones that you can look at online through the library website, but they're really annoying to use, and so I just ordered this one, which is also not very extensive, but um, is okay.
Mm.
Um, yeah, no, there's no distinction. I guess maybe if your question is there a distinction between sensibility and intuition? Then the answer is yes. Because
And intuition falls under sensibility, right?
well, it's a limit case of sensibility, or I guess maybe
Uh-huh.
that's what you're asking. Um, a limiting case. In other words, sensibility is the more general term. I guess
Uh-huh.
I don't know if
Yes.
that's true. I don't know if that's right. Because I don't think we ever get to sensibility outside of the forms of intuition. But sensibility
Mm.
is simply the like the raw data, and
Hmm.
intuition is the raw data as it is shaped for us in space and time. And so if
Hmm.
you're going to say that, I mean, I suppose conceptually you could talk about intuited sensibility as a like a special form of sensibility in general. But the thing is that we would never have access to that. You never have
Mm.
access to sensibility outside of space and time.
Oh,
All
I see.
sensibility
Yeah,
always shows up to you in space and time.
necessarily. Right.
Yeah,
And sensibility would be uh in contrast to uh cognition,
that's
right?
correct. That's correct. Yes.
In the same way that intuition is in contrast to understanding.
Sort of. The thing is that to get to time, Kant says that we already have to have, and so very often the word representation or presentation can be translated as simply awareness.
Mm, mm,
So
mm.
in order to get to an experience of time or, you know, an awareness of time, we already have to have an awareness of series. And the awareness of series, according to Kant, derives from the hypothetical judgment. So even in intuition before the understanding, if it's in time, there's something logical about it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
And presentation or representation would be the most generic term,
Yeah,
right?
it's
So it would
really
be
generic. You could translate it as awareness. I mean, honestly, you could translate it as maybe awareness is the best way because like if you have an idea, you're aware that you have the idea. If you see a cat, you're aware that you see a cat.
mm,
So maybe that's one way to get at it. Presentations are awarenesses. Um, the problem with using the word awareness is that it's non-countable, and so maybe the better translation in Kant is apperception, which is a different thing. You probably have seen the word apperception, right?
I don't recall.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah, maybe
that's a really common word. So you'll see it in Kant literature all the time.
maybe I've seen it, I just passed it over.
Apperception just means self-consciousness.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. Yeah, okay. Okay. I've
So
I've seen consciousness of the self a bunch.
okay, well
So
that's apperception. Yeah.
okay.
But apperception need not necessarily be, thoroughly conceptual in the way that the phrase consciousness of the self sounds like it's kind of conceptual, like you're thinking about what selfhood is or whatever. Apperception
Oh.
simply means so like the synthetic unity of apperception. That's a very common Kantian phrase. I'll write it here. Of apperception means the sense that when you have any experience whatsoever, sensory experience, thinking, anything, it always comes to you as being unified in your consciousness. And
Mm,
there are two aspects to that that are important. The fact that it's unified in a consciousness and that that consciousness has the feeling of possession by you, right? Um,
mm.
and so apperception can be as basic as that. Simply
Oh,
I mean, it's almost weird to call it an awareness because if I think about it, I can say, yes, of course, my thoughts and perceptions are in one consciousness, mine. But most of the time, that's not part of what I'm experiencing. It's like the necessary condition or the like just the platform for experience. But what he
mm.
thinks is that there are all sorts of interesting uh, epistemological uh, claims about the self and whatnot that he derives from that phenomenon. But you know, apperception could also be thought of as awareness, and in a certain sense, maybe that's the better translation or the better correspondence because they're both uncountable nouns. You just have apperception, like you just have awareness, whereas presentations are countable,
Oh,
right? So then they're closer to things like thoughts or ideas or perceptions or whatever, right?
oh, I
But if you
see.
ever say, I have an awareness of X versus I have awareness, then you could think of awareness and awareness of something as a presentation.
Oh, okay. Okay, okay. Got it. And would you be able to place these on sort of like a hierarchical sort of chart or like a flow chart for where you would say, here's the presentation, and then it comes down to cognition or um uh uh,
Mm,
sensibility,
mm.
and then sensibility would go down to intuition, or cognition would go down to understanding and all that. Is there a way to, would that be a
Oh
good way
yeah, I
to think
mean,
about it?
depending on what you're trying to diagram with that. I mean, what is it? What is that diagram supposed to elucidate for me? Because
Well, from
it's not, for instance, I mean, maybe you're talking about logical dependence or decreasing generality,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
just decreasing generality, then yeah, I mean, presentations like the most general. And then
Hmm.
you could have phenomenal or intellectual noumenal, right?
Hmm.
And you could have you know, different specifications of those things, right?
Okay,
But
I see.
yeah.
And then,
Anyway,
yeah, yeah.
I kind of
Sorry,
want to
go
get
ahead.
out of like basic terminology because we haven't even started talking about the sublime yet.
Yeah, sorry, sorry. No, this is, I struggled a bunch with these.
Yeah,
But
okay.
the Kant dictionary will help me out. I'll check
Yeah,
that out. Yeah, thank you.
okay. So let's jump in. No, I'm gonna go get a soda or something because I'm starting to feel
Okay.
a little. I had a an hour and a half meeting before I met you too, so
Oh my goodness, I'm
I'm a
so
little
sorry.
phased, but I'll be back in a minute. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Okay.
And by the way, I mean, I would totally be okay if you think it's better if we meet another time,
It's
if
just
it's too much.
I can power through. I got at least
Okay,
another hour left in my tank, so I might
awesome.
I might close my eyes a few times while I'm listening to you, but I'm paying attention. So okay.
Okay.
So I mean, it's a little hard, especially since if this were a course, I would have prepared handouts and I'd lead the discussion a little bit more. But it is easiest for me to start off with you giving me a summary and spending some time on things that you don't understand or that just seem, you know, like confusions on Kant's part, you know.
Mm,
But yeah, let's just jump into it. And I'll try to guide you with some questions as well, but let's see what you've got. What do you understand from Kant's theory?
okay. Well, honestly, not much
Okay.
because
Okay.
I would get stuck on every single page. And then I'd go down like a rabbit hole
Well,
of like trying to figure out the
let's
preliminary
start at
stuff.
a higher level um, of organization. Kant describes two species of the sublime.
there is the dynamic and there's the mathematical,
Yes,
right?
yes. And
Okay.
what's significant in that distinction?
And there seems to be a matter of superiority. That's an important one, especially in the dynamic of superiority over nature.
Hmm.
That's understood cognitively, right? So
Yeah.
it's like there
Actually,
are
in a way, okay, you're jumping down too fast to details. Let's try to stay at a higher level of generality with
okay.
things and really talk about what's at stake in the mathematical versus the dynamically sublime.
Is it the distinction between the quantity versus quality?
Yeah, that's one way to describe it in terms of his categories. Yeah. So what does that mean exactly?
So a mathematical uh uh judge so I guess would you call it like a judgment of the sublime? Or
Yeah.
yeah, it would have to do with uh quantifiable uh I guess let me quantifiable descriptions.
Uh-huh.
So like if I think he starts out by like talking about like how large something is, and that's
Yes.
something
Yes.
that can be quantified,
Yeah.
whether in numbers or in other formats.
I would hesitate to talk about it in terms of descriptions. Now, Kant is describing something here, but what he's describing is, I don't think, supposed to itself be a description.
Okay.
He's talking about, like a certain way of synthesizing a judgment in experience,
Hmm.
right? Which is not a description because a description is going to be at, in order of intentionality removed from the experience, right? The description refers to the experience, but it's not itself the experience. And
Oh,
what
okay.
he's describing is really the experience. Oh.
Uh-huh. I
Okay.
see, I see.
So, so that's significant to kind of distinguish what's going on here. And you're right that largeness plays a big role here. In the case of the mathematically sublime, to a certain extent, it is a little bit easier to, or I don't know if it's easier, but it's a little bit more abstract. So it may be that you can kind of think of how this might emerge out of the sorts of thoughts we have when faced with what he describes as great without comparison or great without measure.
Mm.
I think that's around section 25 or so. Excuse me. Um, because normally when you talk about something great, what are you doing? In other words, if I say, "Oh man, that's large," let's say I don't know, um, I'm looking at Mount Rainier or something. I said, "Man, that's huge." What does that have to do with comparison? I mean,
You're always well,
just to be like really clear, normally, if I say that, this finger is bigger than this one, and then I don't know, like, well, I don't have a huge finger. That was a bad example. But let's say I've got, some tiny thing and then something slightly larger, and then I've got something way, way, way larger. I'm making a comparison, right? The idea
right.
of big, the concept big, has no meaning without the concept of comparison. Right?
So
It's
it's
always
relative.
comparative, right? It's always relative. It's always comparative. What about if I say, I'm standing at the Mount Rainier is a weird example because in order to experience it as big, you have to be kind of far away from it. You know,
Yeah, okay, yeah, I
but
guess.
let's say
Yeah.
I'm standing at the sidewalk outside of Columbia Center or whatever it's called in downtown Seattle, the tallest building in Seattle, and I look
Mm.
up and I say, "That building is huge." Think really carefully in the sense of my experience. What am I comparing it to?
Is it other buildings you've seen? Or
No, because let's imagine that you're walking around in the desert or something, I don't know how this would be possible, but let's say I have a blindfold on and I'm in the desert and there's nothing else around me, and I look up and then they take the blindfold off and I see Columbia Tower. I could still say that's huge.
Well, then in that sense, the comparison would be to yourself.
Yeah, exactly right. To your
Hmm.
body.
Hmm.
That the judgment X is great, X is large, has entailed in it some comparison to your own body,
Hmm.
your own limitations as an embodied being, right? So that's something that's important for the sublime, right? Now, what he says about the sublime is that the sublime is that which is great without measure or great without
Hmm.
comparison. Now, that's a little strange, right? So, what's going on there? What, in fact, there's only one thing that could possibly be great without comparison. What would it be? There are different names for it, but what would it be? What could possibly be great without comparison? Absolutely great.
Is it God?
Um, well, I don't know. Give me some kind of story about why that would be the answer.
Like the unfathomable greatness, or like just like limitless
But what?
greatness.
Yes, 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 yes. You're on the right track. So,
Uh-huh.
one way that I could have made a problem for you is then or not made a problem, but led you to a more adequate answer is, okay, but what is great about God? And then you would say God's limitlessness.
Hmm.
Oh, in other words, the infinite.
The infinite,
The
right?
only thing that can be thought as great without comparison is infinite,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So, what is your access to infinity? Is infinity a phenomenon? Is infinity an idea? What is it?
It's an idea. It
It's
would
an
be
idea, and ideas are products of
cognitive.
reason.
Hmm. Hmm.
The only thing that is great without measure is reason.
Hmm.
It's reason that has as um, an idea, as a product, the notion infinity, right? Okay. So that takes you pretty far along the path of kind of understanding what's going on with the idea of the sublime. And in the mathematically sublime, what we have is an awareness of infinity despite our own finitude, right? Either in the case of what would actually be more like the dynamically sublime, looking at a really tall building and thinking, and the even better dynamically sublime would be, instead of being at the bottom of the Columbia Center, being at the top and looking down. That
Yeah.
would really be the dynamically sublime for Kant. Um, but in any case, we have an awareness of our limitation and simultaneously an awareness, in the case of the mathematically sublime, of that which is great without limit, right?
Hmm.
And so now there are a couple of ways to kind of get at the tension there, that I think are kind of interesting. Because one of the things that we might think about is, okay, where's the problem in dealing with infinity? Okay, let's say you've got imagination, which is this hugely important faculty for any aesthetic experience, either beautiful or sublime. Um, in what sense is infinity, if at all, and maybe the answer is in no sense is this available for imagination, but in what sense is infinity available to the imagination? And remember, imagination really, it's important. Is it Darstellung in German? I think it's Darstellung. Although, no, it's Vorstellung. That's right. I don't have to look it up. It's Vorstellung. Actually, it's probably not that useful to talk about the German because it's too similar to the word presentation. But what I want to get at is that the imagination, if you remember from last time, the imagination is the place where mind and body kind of sync up, because
Yes.
it's both sensory but also kind of schematically rational, schematically
So kind of like a
As
bridge
well.
between the particular and the universal,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
exactly,
Mhm.
right. Okay. So, but keep in mind also that it's essentially sensual as well, right?
Mm,
Got that sensual aspect to it. So then I would ask, like, is it ever possible for the imagination to deal with infinity? What would that mean? Now, keep in mind that even the sort of schematic, the schematism that is an operation of the imagination is always essentially perceptual. It's like the uncovering of generality in particularity, right? If you remember, like
mm,
the little picture I drew of the car or whatever,
yeah.
right? It's this idea that whenever you experience anything through the senses, you somehow also see in it its generality because of how the imagination is supposed to schematize it. So, how would and remember that this another way to describe what's going on with the schemas, the schematization, is it's a rendering of the categories in terms of space and time,
Mm, mm,
right? Because the categories themselves are non-spatial, non-temporal, right? Even
yes.
if like time it somehow derives from if then itself is not temporal. You can think of that as timeless, as just this sort of dependence relation that has nothing to do with being in time or space or anything. The schematism is supposed to be the rendering of those categories in terms of space and time, or from the other point of view, it's supposed to be the discovering of generality in the particularity of sensation, right? So if you think about, what would infinity mean for the imagination? Is it even accessible at all? Maybe more straightforward way to get at this is to ask, okay, um, you have no trouble with the concept infinity. As soon as I said infinity, you're like, yes, of course, infinity. Now, can you imagine infinity?
No,
No, you can't.
no.
Oh, okay. So then somehow the imagination is failing. It's trying
Mm.
to do something that is possible for reason, but not for the imagination. But in what exactly happens? Describe where the imagination fails. Like, what can it not do? Why is it that you can't imagine infinity?
Because there's no boundaries or limits to grasp onto to identify anything at all or to create um like any sort of
You're basically
idea.
right. You're basically right. Yeah, I mean that's basically right. I would. Mm, I'm trying to get you to use a term that Kant uses in the category of quantity, though. There's something that okay. What are the judgments in the category of quantity?
I don't remember.
Oh,
Um
and it's
it
actually
was,
I think the transcendental form. If you remember, they he has two different names for everything. So, quantity is
all right.
simply universal, particular, singular,
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
but the oh my God, the transcendental forms are sorry, I have to look it up. It's
Mhm,
just a second.
mhm.
I know the name of the one that I want you to come up with. Um, but I can't think of the other two for some reason. Ah, that's right. Okay. Yeah, it's simple. Okay, so universal, particular, singular, then become unity. So in transcendental logic, when you see uh, a group of objects is somehow the same, you're unifying them. Um, Particularity becomes plurality, and singularity becomes totality.
Mhm.
Okay, so what does that mean? universal, unity, particular, plurality, singular, totality.
What does totality mean here? If it's singular, how?
Yeah. Okay, so the first two are probably pretty easy. Like if you see these three things as books,
Mm,
you're unifying them. You've created a
right.
unity in your judgment by saying, yes, they're different, but they're all books. If you say, yeah, but this book is about Kant, this book is about Khalil Gibran. Do you know him?
Yeah, yeah. Khalil
Yeah,
Gibran.
that's Khalil Gibran right there.
Mm,
And this is G.K. Chesterton. So they're all particular. So you've identified the plurality within this group.
mm.
Now, let's take one book. In what sense is a judgment about this singular book a judgment about totality?
I don't
How
know.
much of this book are you looking at right now? Well, this is a stupid question. It's not true. The answer that I want you to give would not strictly be true. But if I'm talking about this book, within the sphere of objects, how much of this book am I talking about? That's not a good question. Maybe I
Very
should.
little of it,
Yeah, I know
right?
that's a bad example. Okay, let's say that I'm drawing. All right. Okay, let's talk about a geometrical point. Let's say that that geometrical point in Cartesian coordinates is at, I don't know, 0, 1 or something.
Mm.
How much of that point am I talking about?
All of it.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, it's a
Oh,
singular thing, but the idea of its singularity means that you're talking about the totality of that singular thing.
oh. Okay, okay. I see.
Yeah. Okay. So what is the imagination doing in the case of, well, geometrical point's bad, but let's say it's a real like point that I draw on a board. Can you imagine a point that I draw on the board? Yeah, I sure can. It's a singular object in my imagination. There, I just thought it.
Mm.
I've totalized it. What about infinity?
The imagination lacks the ability to totalize infinity.
Exactly right. You can't totalize infinity in the imagination. You can totalize infinity through reason.
Mm.
Say,
Oh.
this is the concept infinity. This, or maybe concept's not right. This is the idea infinity. And you define it. And maybe if you're, Georg Cantor, then you show mathematically that there are different types of infinity, countable and incountable, and you might even rationally be able to demonstrate certain properties of different types of infinities, etc. Okay, but then you go up to Georg Cantor and say, okay, so imagine in your mind the infinite series of real numbers. And it's like, what are you talking about? I can't do that.
That's right. Because then if you were to really truly imagine it, you need to totalize it, which
Exactly.
is impossible.
Exactly. Now,
Ah.
what I might then be led to say, let's say I want to define my ability to imagine infinity, then I might think, okay, well, but I could just keep counting without ending. So here's the thing, like if you define as you did before, infinity is simply that which is without limit, I can just keep counting on and on and on and on forever. And I can think the numeric series, I can imagine it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, no problem. The thing is, though, that I can never get to a number that is ultimately large because I could always just add 1 to it,
Hmm.
right? And so, to the extent that the imagination has some access to infinity, it always has only a partial access to it. It has, and part of the reason it has only partial access to it is because it is always temporal, right? Whereas the notion infinity is not temporal.
Hmm.
Even though you can talk about infinite time or something, the infinite expanse of time, the notion itself, infinity, is somehow like the totality of that, which is
Yeah.
itself outside of time, right?
Hmm.
Or outside of succession. Or maybe a way to think about it is um, imagine an infinitely asymptotic curve.
Hmm.
Um, you could define a curve that when the function of the curve taken as a whole is taken as a whole, you could say that it reaches one. It's just that you can never identify the point at which it reaches one. It's just if you take the entirety of the function, then you reach one. But at any point along the function, you don't reach one.
Is that true? Is if you
I don't
take the
know.
entire?
It seems like in asymptote, the definition is that it doesn't ever reach one. It's just infinity.
Yeah, I thought that
What
was the
I'm trying to
case.
describe is a way of thinking about getting closer to something. I think it might be true. I have to, it's been a while since I did calculus, but I think, if you're saying that it's infinitely getting closer, it only doesn't reach one if you think about it in time. But if you were to say that it's infinitely closer, if you take the entirety of the infinity, then it seems like it would reach it.
Oh,
So what I'm saying is that the judgment that I'm trying to make there is kind of outside of the function, is taking the function as a whole.
yeah, I
Because what
see.
does it mean to say that you're constantly getting closer infinitely? To say that you don't reach it is to sort of be within the succession. But if you could somehow like get outside of the succession of numbers and take the succession as a whole, not any point in the succession, but the whole succession itself, then you would have, I think, I don't know, I'm not a mathematician, so I might be wrong, but certainly is a coherent concept to say that it only doesn't reach one, for instance, if you are taking it from the perspective, from an internal, uh, from a perspective internal to the succession, it doesn't reach one. But from a perspective external to the succession, it does.
In the same way that if we were to just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, we wouldn't reach infinity. But if we kind of take
Yeah,
infinity as a whole, we reach
we'd get
infinity.
closer, but you don't get it because you can't totalize it in the imagination, in the succession. You have to somehow be non-successive in order to think infinity.
Yeah, which is to
Right.
just to understand or to take infinity as a whole through reason,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Right.
Hmm. I see.
Exactly.
I see.
Okay, so that gets us to what is great without measure, which is going to be an idea of reason, infinity. And that there's a way in which sensibility, imagination necessarily falls short because it is temporal, because it's sensorial, etc. Um, and the specific reason that uh, imagination falls short is because it can't totalize infinity as an object in the imagination, which shows us the limitation of
Hmm.
imagination and sensibility and the body side of imagination. But at the same time, it awakens an awareness of another faculty that we have that can totalize it as an idea, though not as an object, even an imaginary object. So that's more or less the mathematically sublime. The dynamically sublime then is interesting because that's where nature comes in. So you want to say anything about that? What do you remember about the the dynamically sublime?
Oh, so that's where there's this understanding of or there's this feeling of superiority over nature because you understand it through reason, right? But then
Maybe. Now we got to be really careful here because
okay.
actually this is true of the mathematically sublime as well. But it's important to note that Kant thinks that the sublime is an aesthetic judgment and not
Hmm.
a judgment of understanding or a judgment of reason.
Oh, okay.
Right? Well, what you just said would make me think, oh, so the sublime is just, you know, an analysis that the understanding makes of my situation and says, even though it's kind of scary, you know, you're not in danger, so therefore it's not dangerous, therefore don't be afraid. Okay, but that's not an aesthetic experience.
Hmm.
That's a logical experience. That's a logical judgment, right? So then how is the sublime? Now, I'm not saying that that analysis is totally off the mark. It's just that you got to keep in mind that the sublime is also supposed to be an aesthetic judgment, just like the beautiful, and therefore not really logical or conceptual in this sense, although it's maybe more of a hybrid judgment than the judgment of the beautiful. And so maybe, reason plays more of a role. But keep in mind that it's an embodied experience in the first instance as well. Anyway, continue. What were you going to say?
Well, I'm wondering that that's just about it because if it's because I thought that it was the reason that it was not that I thought well I thought that it was like this knowing that yes like it's dangerous but I'm not in danger that sort of thing. But if
Mm-hmm.
it's not that, then how could it
I'm
be?
not saying that it's not that.
It's not
I'm
just
just
that,
sort of
right?
saying that to claim that knowing that you're not in danger is the sublime is like saying knowing that a Mondrian painting uses lots of right angles is the judgment of beauty. No, it's not.
Hmm.
Just remember that the judgment of beauty is not conceptual in that sense, it's aesthetic. And the judgment of the sublime is also supposed to be aesthetic. Now, it's true that part of the explanation for the pleasure comes from an awareness of the rational faculty in subjectivity. But it's important to remember that it is an aesthetic judgment and not just, a conceptual judgment. Anyway, okay, so yes, that's it's a big part of the sublime that involves the pain of, the fear of danger. Let's take it in the most kind of like materialist terms first, and then talk about different ways that you might experience pain in the sublime. So maybe like the most obvious way to describe it is I'm scared, and then I realize, oh, this thing has no power over me. Now,
Hmm.
one of the reasons that um, it might not be sufficient to say you're not in danger, although Kant does say that the sublime is only possible when you have a certain distance. Um, but I think that, and in fact, I think he might actually even say a safe distance or something like that. I think there is the idea of safety in one of the passages. But even so, I think that it's possible to think of a sublime experience where you really are in danger. In fact, the most sublime experiences, skydiving or whatever, you really are kind of in danger,
Hmm.
right? And so the safety may not be material safety of just, well, I'm not going to die. The safety would be the awareness that even if I do die, nature has not conquered me,
Hmm.
right? And that would be truly sublime. I suppose if you die, then who knows, either you no longer exist or you're in the afterlife, whatever. Maybe then you have a different judgment. But it does seem to me that the truly sublime isn't just sort of like, oh, I'm watching a volcano erupt on my computer and it's massive, but I'm at home drinking, coffee. So I know I'm not in danger, even though I'm looking. No, that's not sublime. Sublime is when you're really on the volcano.
Yeah.
Right? So then it's not quite accurate to say, well, you've made a rational analysis and realized that you're not actually going to die. Because part of the sublime means really being in danger, but with an awareness that even your death is not, has death has not conquered you.
Hmm.
Death
Hmm. Hmm.
cannot conquer you. That's what the sublime is supposed to be. And where does that awareness that death, even if I do die, death has not conquered me, how do you explain that?
That's what I was gonna ask. Is that where reason comes in?
Hmm.
Oh, is it that my understanding of the phenomenon or of the event uh overcomes my death? It's like the fact that I understand that, like,
Yeah, okay, maybe.
you
Maybe
know.
understanding isn't so important here. I mean, really what we've got is imagination in conflict with, okay. So let me say it this way. We talked about judgments of the beautiful as being the harmony between imagination and understanding.
Hmm.
Maybe it makes more sense to talk about the sublime as the conflict between imagination and reason,
Oh.
right? That it's not even so much the understanding in terms of, you know, whatever, I'm a world-renowned volcano expert, and I know that at this distance with this protective gear, I probably won't be injured, and therefore I'm not scared, and therefore it's sublime. Honestly, that sounds like it would totally um, disenchant the experience.
Hmm.
It's supposed to be a sort of enchantment in the experience of the sublime. And the enchantment really is dangerous. It's the possibility of being overwhelmed, being destroyed, but only in a material sense. And that there is another awareness, another presentation in human experience of um, a dimension to human experience that is not, cannot be destroyed physically, which is to say human freedom, human reason. And here, freedom and reason means morality, right? And
Hmm.
morality, we have to, that's the word that gets used a lot when you talk about Kant. I'd say most of the time when people use the word morality in everyday American contexts, they have a kind of negative opinion of that word. Morality just means like somebody getting mad that I use the wrong pronouns or use the F word or something like that. And
Hmm.
so, like the morality police. But morality has a much deeper and kind of wider meaning in this tradition, which means the capacity for humans to be motivated by reason and not by causality, material causality,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? And so morality just means freedom, rational freedom, the freedom to pursue your higher nature, right? Okay. In
Oh.
other words, the theory that we aren't just robots, biological robots that are completely determined by, you know,
Like instincts.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
Hmm.
There really is a normative dimension to human experience that is good, right? And
Hmm.
not just descriptively neutral, just is what happens. No, that there's a right way to have a human world, and that humanity is a way in which the universe sort of um, becomes conscious of itself and achieves its ends, right? That you can think about human rationality as a biological adaptation, but it's and so therefore just nature, but nature producing something that is itself going beyond its limitations as nature, right? That it is creating a sort of nature. To say that human beings are self-conscious is essentially to say nature is self-conscious, right? And nature being self-conscious means that if part of our self-consciousness is the desire to act and to create a world that is just and right and um, you know compassionate, or maybe for Kant compassion is not that important, but all the things that we think make the world better, that's really just the universe achieving its higher purpose, its higher end,
Oh.
this kind of thing, right? Well, in that sense, if the volcano destroys me, it doesn't really matter because, the moral vocation of nature continues, right? And I have an awareness of that through reason, essentially.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, okay, because actually, like I remember last time, uh, like at some point you were kind of talking about causality versus normativity.
Hmm.
And I couldn't understand then why these two would be in opposition to one
Hmm.
another. But I can see that now.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Mm,
So that's one typical reading of Kant's solution to the sublime.
mm.
It's one that I've always hated. I hate that analysis.
Why?
I think, well, because there are all sorts of things about it. Actually, the way that I just described it is derived more from Friedrich Schiller. Schiller talks about this too, in a more sort of poetic way. And I suppose if you think of the rationality and its pursuit of the highest good as flowing from nature itself, then it's a little bit less antagonistic. But in Kant, you very much have a structure of antagonism, of conflict between um, the body, right? I am in danger, I will die, or I am small and limited, and the mind, but I have access to this notion of infinity, or I realize that my death will not hamper the pursuit of the highest good, this kind of thing, right? And so there's this conflict between mind and body. And what seems to be implied by the analysis that I just gave is that the world is scary to us a lot of the time, um, but it shouldn't be scary to us because we have dominion over it because we're rational.
Hmm.
And there, there's all sorts of kind of problematic things about, the power of reason to subjugate nature. This idea that what makes us valuable is not our natural being, but our rational being, and so on. And it discounts the body and it discounts this world. But
Oh,
as I said, the trick is to remember that the sublime is not a rational judgment in the sense that you know, if A then B, if B then C, therefore if A then C is a
hmm.
rational judgment. It's an aesthetic judgment, which is to say that it's an embodied judgment, it's a sensorial judgment, right? And the thing is that it's really just the question, you really only have to bring reason into the question of the sublime to explain the source of pleasure in the sublime, at least according to Kant. Um, and actually, this gets us into the kind of more difficult aspect of the sublime as an aesthetic judgment, because what you've been saying, and kind of the account that I gave recently, is that, okay, so if in the first instance we're simply scared or we feel small or whatever, and then we think about it rationally, and then we think, aha, I'm not small at all, I'm powerful. Why would we seek out sublime experiences? It's like, why would we want to feel the pain? It
Yeah, it's
just
like
sort of
some
seems like
masochistic.
we've already solved the problem by thinking about it rationally. So why do we want to go back and throw ourselves back into the problem and experience the pain over and over again?
Because there's a simultaneous pleasure involved.
I understand that, but the point is, let me put it this way. Um, I don't know. Let's say my bicycle is broken. Okay, so I've got a problem, and then I think about it rationally. Um, I put together a chain or whatever. I glue my chain together. Whatever. I fix it. I use reason to fix it, and then I feel pleasure because I fixed the problem. But then I probably wouldn't want to break my chain again
Hmm.
because I've already solved the problem, and it wouldn't be pleasurable to solve it again and again and again and
Oh,
again.
oh, I see.
right? I mean, there is something a little strange about the sublime, which is not just that it is pleasure understood as the triumph of reason over, the body or something. There's something a little bit more complicated about it. And you can see the complication in virtue of the fact that we actually kind of like the pain, right? And actually, there are places in the sections between about 25 and 28 or so where Kant talks about it in two different ways. As he talks about the sublime as being a negative pleasure, which is an odd idea, a negative pleasure. But then also sometimes he talks about it as being something like a complex phenomenon, some complex mixture of pleasure and pain. And then sometimes he talks about it as a successive presentation, which is more like the way we've been talking about it, which is, I'm scared. I use reason. Now I feel pleasure.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm interested in the notion of it as a complex, as a negative pleasure, as something that's both pleasurable and painful at the same time. And one way that you might think about it also is not so much only in terms of morality, right? Or reason understood as a tool of control over nature or something like that, but also something that I tried to mention a little bit earlier, which is sort of like the coming to self-consciousness through the violence of nature,
Hmm.
right? And what I mean by the coming to self-consciousness, I mean there are a few different ways to think about it. But if you think about like what I was describing before as of reason, or the world of moral ends as something that emanates out of nature, what is that process of emanation? What does that look like? One thing that it might look like is the experience of the sublime, wherein I'm challenged, my body is challenged, my limited mind and apprehension is challenged in such a way that my subjectivity becomes stronger. That is to say, I'm put in mind of my rational vocation as a moral being. And so you can see there a sort of development of rational subjectivity out of conflict.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that might be what the pleasure is, that, there's a sense that when when I experience something as sublime, in as much as it makes me feel like more of a subject, it makes me feel more alive. It makes me more aware of my experience of the world and my
Hmm.
sort of view on the world, both aesthetically but also rationally. And it's something about that, about the way that the sublime, in sort of articulating my subjectivity, gives me a sense of vitality, gives me a sense of this awareness of who I am and where I am and what I have to fight with or contend with. That in itself is perhaps a reason that it would be the sort of thing we would seek out, right? Because it
Oh.
makes us feel more alive, both in the sense of the sort of energy that is involved in a conflict, but then also more alive in the sense of feeling more full as a human being, more fully aware of my um, physical powers, but then also my rational powers, something like that.
Wow. Okay. Write that down.
But I suppose here you can also kind of see a connection to the mind-body problem, right? That we talked about last time. One of the things I was saying before is that you
Is
can,
it just that
yeah,
like the mind would be aware of it's the awareness that occurs in the mind that's in conflict with the limitations of the body?
yeah. So if you think about the beautiful, Kant's response to the mind-body problem is one of um, unification, right?
Hmm.
That is to say, rather than thinking of the mind and the body as separate substances, they're somehow unified in the imagination, essentially, right? Or in the act of aesthetic experience, which is both sort of normative. I mean, not sort of, it really is normative, but also sensuous,
Hmm.
right? Or at least occasioned by sensuality, so that there's this sort of harmony or this unity between mind and body. In the sublime, you become much more aware, at least in the first instance, of the conflict between mind and body, right? If we take that first analysis that we looked at, where we said, okay, so I'm scared, pain, because I see myself only as a body, but then I feel pleasure because I realize I also have a mind.
Hmm.
Um, but if you take kind of the second, more complex reading, that what you have as a product of the sublime is this greater awareness of your own power, of your own aliveness, then you see that, for one thing, rationality emerges out of the conflict of bodies. It's not that there's the conflict of bodies. Oh, yes, and I also have this other thing over here that I'll, apply to this problem. Rationality is that there's reason itself actually is a form of self-consciousness that emerges out of the conflict between bodies. And it's something about that emergence, that awareness of my developing powers as a subject, as a full person, that I find pleasurable. That there you see this maybe another sort of interesting way of harmonizing the mind with the body, except here, instead of it being about harmony or unity, it's about um, subjectivity arising out of conflict.
Hmm.
Subjectivity here meaning like rationality.
And
Um,
that awareness, right?
yeah, and so if you were to think about it in Freudian terms, it's like what is sometimes called a sublimation, right?
Uh,
If you've ever heard that term sublimation, you know what that means?
I don't remember it, but I've heard it a bunch.
Okay, sublimation in Freud's terms means okay, so let's say that you have some problem that you can't deal with. There are a couple techniques that people have. Your father beat you as a child, so one thing you might do is just try to forget it. Try
Uh-huh.
to, and in other words, the word for that is repress it, right? And then it'll come back in all sorts of weird forms, like, I don't know, maybe you have um, trouble in school or something because you're actually
Right.
really angry, but you're not angry at your teachers or at the homework, you're angry at your father, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's repression, and that's supposed to be unhealthy. Sublimation is where you channel that negative emotion into some higher project. So,
Mm.
for instance, your father beat you as a child and it makes you become an alcoholic, repression. But then somehow you channel the pain of childhood and your alcoholism into creating really, really powerful, but maybe painful and powerful art.
Mm.
That's sublimation. And so you can read what Kant's talking about here, not only as, you know, there's this body stuff, this conflict. Aha, reason comes to save the day. But also as this way of thinking of reason itself as a sublimation, as something that occurs out of the experience of the sublime. Or maybe we wouldn't want to go so far. If I really want to be a Kantian, I wouldn't go so far as saying that reason is created by the sublime or the conflict of bodies. But one thing I might say is, even if reason has been there all along, I'm not put in mind of that fact except through the conflict that I experience in the
Oh.
sublime.
Oh,
These
that
are the
actually
things.
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
And so I think Kant would never argue that reason is only psychological, or that reason somehow, is an evolutionary adaptation. He would not argue that. But what I think you could say in the analysis of the sublime is that, most of the time, if you're skydiving, your immediate thought isn't, I should help old ladies cross the street more often, right? Or something like that, right? Even though you could get there rationally and so on. What you do have, though, is this awareness of, even though you're in danger, there's some aspect to your being that is not physical, that is not that would somehow not be diminished by your dying. And that is reason, but it's this moment where the pain and the scariness and the conflict of this awakens you to that. And that's supposed to be what's sublime.
Okay. Yeah. That's very epic.
Oh yeah, it's
It,
epic.
yeah.
It's epic. It's totally epic. Yeah, definitely. The sublime is supposed to be epic, and that's one of the things that I hate about that kind of simple analysis, where it's like, oh, scary, reason, oh, pleasure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Epic.
It's epic, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you need it to be about this struggle in this sort of developing awareness of your capacities as a rational subject. Right. And that your capacity as a rational subject doesn't mean something stupid like help old ladies cross the street more, or, um, whatever,
Like donate more to charity or something
or
like that.
or even something like there are countable and uncountable infinities or this kind of thing. It's more you know, your awareness that there's a dimension to human experience, a dimension to human value that is that can't be completely explained through material biological cause and effect and this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I suppose even so, you could, if you were a Freudian or a Darwinian, you could still claim that yes, but rationality is just happens to be a very powerful defense mechanism that helps you deal with painful experiences or something like that. But what Kant would say is that, and this is something that he says all the time, is that just because you can give um, a physical account of any behavior, of any thought, or anything like that, that doesn't mean that um, there is not also this normative dimension to your experience or to your thinking, right?
Mm.
The idea being that, like I could always give you an account of the neurons firing in your brain and say that's all it means to think about morality. But actually, that doesn't, it doesn't, for one thing, it doesn't rule out the possibility that there really is this normative structure independent of the neurons. Um, and it certainly doesn't show that what we call normative deliberation is just reducible to neurons firing. And one further claim that you might want to make is that even though you can always make those physicalist accounts, there's a seeming to me, a seeming that my thoughts really are normative, that I really ought to do the right thing. And that seeming is just as real in my experience as my observation of neurons firing. Right.
Mm.
And so, that's part of what it means to be awoken to your power as a rational subject. It means
Oh,
you're
okay.
free. You have this radical sort of freedom, but it's a freedom to pursue your higher nature.
And that's how Kant answers the mind-body problem, right? Or at least one
Yeah,
of the
or
ways.
at least responds to it. Whether it's an
Yeah.
answer or not, I think that there are definite aspects of the mind-body problem in the sublime, because really what you're talking about, the fear, the pain is body, the pleasure is mind. That's a really stupid version of it, but it's much more complex and interdependent and all this kind of stuff. It's the emergence of an awareness of the pleasure of subjectivity out of the pain of the conflict and whatnot. But you can see that that is very easily described in terms of mind and body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Got it.
Yeah, I mean, there's more to be said about it. That's probably a decent introduction, and I hope that
No, this is great because I don't think I would have been able to gather that on my own. So I'm
yeah.
gonna I can it's good to have this introduction in mind so that I can when I actually read it, I have something cling on to.
Yeah, and I think that, what I'm trying, hopefully, and maybe you'll have to think about this a little bit more, but one link that I hope might be clear is between the dynamically sublime and the mathematically sublime. What does the ocean, what does, a mountain with some clouds around it have to do with
Hmm.
infinity, mathematical infinity? What? These things seem really different. Um, and I really, it has to do with, you could sort of think of the dynamically sublime sort of takes the structure of the mathematically sublime, but populates it with concepts of nature and freedom, right? Because the mathematically sublime is kind of independent of this whole story about nature and freedom and developing, subjectivity out of conflict. But the structure is still there, right? The structure of the mathematically sublime is still kind of there because the freedom is a sort of infinity of reason, right? Um, it's reason understood as something that can deal with the concepts of the undetermined, the unlimited, the infinite, that somehow emerges out of an awareness that you are a finite body that is in danger.
Hmm.
Right? So you can kind of think of the mathematically sublime as maybe like a more reduced version, right? Like, in a way, a little bit less epic version of the dynamically sublime because it's not about, I mean, you can tell a story about freedom and limitation and whatnot with the mathematically sublime, but it just becomes much more epic when you start to add in nature and, you know, uh, the value of human subjectivity and this kind of stuff, right? And that's what the
Hmm.
dynamically sublime is supposed to do.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All
Yeah.
right. Do you want to read any more Kant? I mean, we at some point in the future we could try to knock out a session on genius or actually one thing I was thinking if you wanted to continue, I know that Justin already emailed me and wants to keep doing like a reading group, so that could be kind of good. At least two people. Sandish might want to do it too. The question would be what you'd want to read next. There are all sorts of directions it could go in. I have some thoughts. I guess I'll hear if you had any thoughts.
I mean, I would always be interested in Kant just because of how substantial it is, and especially the teleology.
Mhm.
I know nothing about that one, and so
Yeah.
it
Well,
would be
that's a
nice
whole
to,
year.
yeah, I'm sure.
um,
But also
I would
if
really like
just,
that too. I would really like that too, actually.
yeah, yeah.
Because I've covered the aesthetic side of this so many times in the past that the thing about the teleology section, as long as you treat it as interesting literature, um, and maybe the source of an interesting critique of scientific explanation, contemporary scientific explanation, um, I think it's quite good. If you're a typical philosopher who, in addition to wanting the stuff you read to be interesting, you also want it to be true,
Mhm.
there may be some problems with Kant's theory of biology and whatever.
Oh.
It's kind of dated, but nonetheless, I think it's pretty interesting, especially when you get to there's this section called the antinomy of teleological judgment, which
Mm.
in a sense sort of ties the whole thing together, which has to do with essentially an analysis of um, a sort of melancholy or almost kind of like tragic condition in human experience of the world as feeling like it's pregnant with meaning or feeling like it is all inclining towards some higher end, and yet with the human inability to ever identify that end.
Mm.
And he thinks that that's a necessary condition or a necessary consequence of the um, the fact that we have two modes of presentation. We have sensibility and we have intelligibility, and that these things are not totally in sync, they're not totally compatible, they're certainly not unified. And the solution to his problem requires that he posit what is called intellectual intuition,
Mm.
which is to say a complete unity between sensibility and intelligibility. So
And
that
he
to think
believes that.
something, so that to think something is to perceive it, and to perceive something is to think it, or there's not even really, that doesn't even make any sense because it's just this unified way of apprehending the world, that it's
Mm.
not kind of in this there's not this conflict between sensibility and the intellect, which, by the way, that's the basis of the sublime. You see that structure in the sublime, right? The sublime is the conflict between intelligibility and sensibility and whatnot. Uh, but in any case, it is quite interesting because then he talks about what it must be like for God to experience the world and this kind of
Oh, oh
thing.
wow.
Well, of course,
No, that is really
he
interesting.
says we can't actually comprehend it because you can't comprehend what it would mean to, for instance, you know, it's there in the Judgment of the Beautiful too, but the fact that his analysis of beauty means that I'm sort of like making a propositional argument where instead of concepts I'm using feelings,
Mm.
right? That kind of gets you close to that, but it's this idea that in the infinite intellect, these things aren't different, right? You know, intellect and sensation are there's no distinction. It's all just sort of this unified apprehension of the world. Um, but in any case, since we don't have access to that, we're always in this kind of sad position of feeling like the world is inclining towards a higher purpose, but never being able to actually reach it, never being able to identify
Uh,
something like that.
that's interesting because you can see almost like foreshadowings of like existentialism later on in a lot of
Uh, I
this.
I'm surprised you say existentialism. I would have gone with German idealism, but why existentialism?
I don't know. I just think like this like last time too, this idea of like, well, what you just said about the world moving towards it, like having an inclination towards meaning. I immediately thought of like this desire for a meaning, but then not never being able to actually like attain it, you
Oh, I
know.
see. I see. Yeah, yeah, maybe so.
More absurdism than
Yeah, yeah, maybe
existentialism.
so. Maybe so. Yeah, I mean, there definitely are, you know, so if I were to quote Nietzsche and say something, well, paraphrase Nietzsche and say something like, the world is meaningful because we make it meaningful. There's a
Mm.
sense in which that's just the Copernican turn, right? That
Oh, okay.
like I'm making the world meaningful. It's not that the world is meaningful and I'm finding the meaning. I'm making the world meaning because I'm taking the world and making it fit me,
Yeah.
right? Same with Sartre and his ideas about radical freedom. They all basically derive from Kant.
Mm.
And you can
Or Camus' Rebellion, Metaphysic Rebellion.
yeah. So yeah, there definitely are there's definitely a lineage between existentialism and Kant. I would say that Kant is still very much, though, on the side of logical analysis and conceptual analysis in a way that, and commitment to the truth,
Mm.
in
Yeah.
a way that is not really the case with existentialism. But it's interesting because, as I say, oh, actually, this is the last person I talked to, not you. I mean, there's a sense in which people talk about Kant as the last common ancestor between continental and analytic philosophy. And
Um,
I think you can even start to divide it down into which critique is the most influential. I think that existentialism takes the third critique as a starting point, but not the first critique, at least not
mm.
the positive arguments of the first critique. Maybe the actual, like, the critique side of the first critique is there in existentialism, but maybe without the positive epistemology. But in any case, I gotta
Right.
go. And anyway, did we want to meet again before? Let's see, it's I don't know. We could meet in October, or we could meet in a couple of weeks if you just want to knock out the section on genius. It's up to you.
Um, I'm okay with either one. I guess I have an audition in early, like right before school starts. So could we do October?
Yeah, yeah, just beginning of October sometime. Well, we've got
Yeah,
time. Do you know what the first day of classes is?
it's 25th.
Oh my God, that's way too soon. Oh my God. All right. Well, how about let's see. Um, I don't know what day of the week is good. Maybe
I guess October, let's see.
I mean, I'll be kind of fried on Friday, so I think I'd prefer not to do it. I think I Mondays would be good. Um,
Okay. Mondays, I have September 30th.
yeah, that could work.
Okay. Does 11 a.m. work for you?
Sure, I guess so. It's a bit late for me, but maybe I can schedule a lesson or something before that. Um,
Okay. I have I could do because I have a class at 9.
yeah, okay. Well, let's say 11 for now. And I think I gave you the sections on Genius to read a few months ago, so we could just do that. Um,
Okay.
and maybe, if you want to suggest, or I can suggest some secondary literature or something, might be helpful if there's some stuff that you're having trouble reading.
On Kant.
Yeah, I have plenty of stuff I could recommend, but
Oh, that would be wonderful. I was going to ask you
oh, well,
actually.
I don't know if it would be one thing you'll figure out pretty quickly, especially with Kant. Maybe this is true with every philosopher, but the more secondary literature you'll read, the less you'll feel like you understand what Kant's talking about.
Oh God.
Um,
That I guess that's okay
I mean,
because
if what you mean by understand what Kant's talking about, having a definitive, denotative summary of what he says versus uh, a sense that you could give a variety of alternative interpretations and talk about their merits and inconsistencies and whatever. That's what you get, but the downside of that is that you feel less like there's an obvious thing that Kant said.
oh,
What you
I
get
see, I
is,
see.
well, this is what this person says, this is what this person says, and actually it's kind of a problem in Kant, but maybe Kant actually meant that.
So there's like a pluralism of ideas, I see.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. And
I'm okay with
I use
that.
that very strongly with Kant just because I think I think Kant is probably the philosopher that has the most secondary literature.
Oh
Probably,
wow.
I think so. Just because he's extremely influential, but he's also kind of obscure. I mean, obscure in the sense of not really clear in his writing.
Yeah, yeah.
Lots of room for interpretation.
Right. No, that I mean it's interesting because like I would be okay with that idea of like I've gotten pretty used to that, but it's really nice because I used to think like I was even afraid to go near any of the critiques because I just thought that like it's totally unavailable to me. But now I can see that it's possible to understand. It's not
Yeah,
there's like
yeah. I mean, the it gets unavailable if you want to jump. Well, first of all, his language is not so easy to
mhm.
parse all the time. But what I was actually watching a lecture about the first critique, and the person who's giving the lecture compared Kant to Gandalf when he fights the Balrog, and
Oh.
he said something like, uh, I don't remember, but somewhere in like wherever is it the Mines of Moria or something, wherever they encounter the Balrog, that Gandalf like goes into battle with the Balrog and then they fall into some abyss, and then Gandalf reemerges after defeating the Balrog as Gandalf the White when he had been Gandalf
Oh.
the Gray, and he says, and that's exactly the situation with Kant, who starts off as Immanuel Kant, professor of logic, and then goes down into the abyss of the first critique and emerges Immanuel Kant, greatest philosopher in all of history. Because the details, it's the details are, I mean, I've read, I took a course on the first critique 20 years ago, and I've read it cover to cover twice. There's still plenty I don't get.
Wow. Wow.
I want to read it again, but it's a real commitment. It's like 700 pages or something.
Yeah.
Um,
Have you seen that photo of this person? He's like, I tried reading this, but I couldn't understand it, so I took a bite out of it, and it's the first critique, and it's got a bite taken out.
did you ever watch the cartoon? Well, actually, when did you come to the United States? How old were you?
Like I was 11 back in 2013.
Oh, so you might not know about the cartoon TV series called Doug.
No, I don't know that one.
Oh, I think it was in like the early 2000s, so you probably wouldn't have caught it anyway. But it's I don't know. He's got a there's an episode where he goes over to some kid's house, and this kid is just like ridiculously brilliant, and he's like, "Oh, what's this?" And he pulls out a copy of the Critique of Pure Reason, and the kid's like, "Oh, that old thing." It's actually pretty interesting because there's this guy Immanuel Kant who's trying to uncover the a priori conditions for possible experience, blah, blah, and then and then Doug starts reading it, and it's like he's reading this section on uh what is it? It's on relation. because he
Oh.
because he started because that's right. He's reading and he comes across the word apodictic, and he's like apodictic, and then his like eyeballs spiral around or something.
Oh. Oh, that's pretty funny. I'll look that up.
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. This is great. And as far as what Justin and Sandesh might be interested in, I'll refrain from suggesting just because I feel bad because last time I said Kant, but I don't know if Justin was interested in it. So
Well, I
I'll
think everybody needs to know some Kant if they want to jump into anything else. But
okay. But I'm also interested in
well,
anything
one thing
else
I
as
was thinking that
well.
might be kind of nice for you, and that I'd like to do is after doing some Kant aesthetics, do John Dewey. I don't know if you're familiar with John Dewey.
No.
Um, yeah, look up John Dewey. He's kind of the father or one of the fathers of American pragmatism.
Oh, okay.
It's been a
Okay,
while
okay.
since he's got a book called Art as Experience. I did a seminar with that. We read through about 5 or 6 chapters of that in one of my seminars about 12 years ago or something, but I wouldn't mind doing that again.
Okay.
I was just thinking that might be kind of useful for you because it's a nice kind of pivot between 18th century German philosophy and Anglo-American philosophy.
Mm-mm.
Because in a way, it's kind of like the third critique plus the theory of evolution.
Oh.
Um, but anyway, I got to go.
Okay.
So
All
I
right.
will see
Thank
you
you so
on.
much, Dr.
Take care. Bye bye.